Hello, my name's Perry Freeman. Good morning to you, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time it is where you are. I'm going to do the first of more than 20 lesson plans for basically a police academy. So these are lessons that I took and I've condensed them for this purpose, because normally they would be 3-hour, maybe 2-hour lectures. I'm going to condense them to try to keep your attention, and I'm just going to cover the basics of a little over 20 lessons that you're going to be exposed to if you go to a police academy. Obviously, we want you to go to a police academy. We need good people in law enforcement. So this will help you, give you a good idea of what you're going to be exposed to. Now, these are not going to be probably in the order that you would receive them, but in order to make them more interesting, I'm going to start with the introduction to the criminal justice system, so you have kind of a feel for what the criminal justice system is. And if you're a cop, you certainly would need to know that. I could start out with constitutional law or something like that, rules of evidence. Actually, that's not that boring, but I want to get a following going here because I've got a lot of good information for you. So we're going to talk about the criminal justice system. Let's take those three words: criminal justice system. Criminal, obviously, that relates to crime and punishment, let's say. We all have rules, regulations, laws that we have to abide by. And so that's the first part of this system. The criminal system has to do with the crime, maybe the punishment. And of course, law enforcement plays very heavily into all aspects of that. The second part of the criminal justice system is the word justice. This basically means the maintenance or the administration of those laws that I just mentioned. There's going to be statute books, ordinance books, all kinds of law books that establish what the elements of the crimes are, what makes them a crime, and the mindset of someone who might commit those crimes. So there's the justice part of it. And then the system itself is an interacting bunch of organizations, of course, law enforcement, the courts, and different bodies that are unified to make sure that justice, that everything is just, J-U-S-T. So the criminal justice system, in a nutshell, those are the three parts of it. Now, the system itself is charged with identifying a crime, identifying the perpetrator of a crime. Law enforcement would be challenged with making an arrest, possibly, building a case. The courts would be challenged with trying that person in a court of law, and hopefully convicting that person. And then there's the punishment that comes after the conviction. So that's the criminal justice system in a very, very small nutshell. Now, in the system, there's actually three separate systems, and I think I just kind of went over them sort of. Law enforcement being the first one, the judicial community, the courts, all of that, and the last one is the corrections part. So let's take law enforcement, and that would probably be the most interesting to you if you're wanting to be a cop, and I assume by watching this, that's where you're coming from, and I want to help you become a cop if you think you should be a cop. Remember that word truth? You're going to hear me probably speak of that in just about every video that I do. Law enforcement community itself. Obviously, they provide protection for the community. They're involved in the prevention of crime, and they serve the people in general. Let me just go into a little bit of the history, maybe, of how law enforcement in America got to where it is today. If we take crime and punishment, let's use those two words. This goes back, probably 7,000 years BC, and what is known today as Iraq. That area of the world was the first area to establish some kind of rules and laws and punishment for people who violated crimes or rules that they had established. I would hate to think what those punishments might have been all those years ago. But anyway, let's take it up to a little more modern times. Sometime in England, and that's kind of where we followed their example. I believe it was around 1829. I may be wrong, 1828. Sometime in that time frame, Sir Robert Peel, he established and presented to Parliament, I assume at the time, a proposal where there would be an organized group of people to enforce the laws in London, basically. I think what he proposed was around 3,000 trained and uniformed personnel to go out into the streets and try to prevent crime and to apprehend and bring to justice those who committed crimes. That evolved into what today is known as Scotland Yard. Now, Scotland Yard has moved from its original building back in the early 1800s to a new location. And I've had the good fortune of working with Scotland Yard. I got to travel there many years ago and work with constables out of Scotland Yard. Quite an experience. I have to say I was treated better over there than I was ever treated here, but that's beside the point. So these 3,000 uniformed and trained people went out into the streets and began what was called the Metropolitan Police Act in London. Now, later on, maybe 1840s, 1844, I believe is a number that comes to mind. Here in the United States, we adopted something similar. Now, we did that in the big cities back east, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. They kind of modeled the Metropolitan Police Act and started training and putting into uniform police officers to put on the streets of these big cities for the very same reasons, to prevent crime and to apprehend those who committed the crimes. Now, as we here in America moved to the West, things changed a bit. Marshals, sheriffs became popular, and they were challenged with the same chores as the bigger cities, and that's protecting the public and preventing crime. Today, in the United States, there's well over 50,000 different police agencies. Around 47,000 of those are police departments. The remaining 3,000 or so are sheriff's offices, marshals, maybe in small towns, communities, and federal agents. So there's a lot of cops. There's no doubt about it. But where would we be without them? So that's kind of how we got to where we are today. So that's the law enforcement part of the three-tiered separate systems of the criminal justice system. Now, the next part is the judicial community itself. Now, this, of course, is our court system, and it's the job of law enforcement to identify, arrest, do their reports, and present their case to the judicial system, the prosecutor. Now, the prosecution side of this criminal justice system has a counter side to it, and that's called the defense. So there's an adversarial situation in the courts. Keep in mind the word truth. The prosecution, just like law enforcement, just like every police officer, has to deal with the truth. Same with a prosecutor in court. Now, the defense attorney, who represents the defendant, who's been charged with a crime, they can fabricate just about anything they want to counter what the prosecution is presenting. And this is something you would have to adjust to if you're going to be a cop. It's not easy for any of us. I've got over 34 years experience in law enforcement. Whole family's been in law enforcement, and we've all had to deal with it, as every other cop has to. It's just the system that we have. So it's very important that your reports be accurate, truthful, all of those things. And the stronger your case is, the stronger your documentation is, the more evidence you can collect, the better off you're going to be. Now, I'm not going to get into the rules of evidence, but there's circumstantial evidence and there's direct evidence, and we'll talk about that in another class. But you need to be very familiar with both. I'm not going to spend any more time on that right now. But collecting evidence, and that includes interviews, physical evidence that you pick up and bring to court, is all very, very important. Now, the last of these three separate parts of the criminal justice system is the corrections part. Everybody thinks that you go to court, you get tried, you get convicted, and you're off to the penitentiary. Not so, or at least you get sent to jail. And keep in mind, a jail houses people mostly charged with misdemeanors or people who are going to be housed for less than a year. And that's in most states and most counties. Now, if you're charged with a felony, you could be sent to the penitentiary, the state penitentiary, for longer periods of time. So keep that in mind. Something you need to know. There's jail and there's penitentiary. But more often than not, there's plea bargaining that takes place between the prosecutor and the defense, rather than the person going to court and facing all of the evidence that you've built against them. The defense attorney and the prosecutor may come to an agreement that they will just plead to something lesser. And in that case, our defendant may get counseling, may get a little bit of jail time, may have to pay fines, may have to pay restitution, may have to go to rehabilitation, those type of things. And then sometimes after incarceration, parole could come in to where they're monitored after they've done some time. During the time of the rehabilitation, the counseling and all that, they're often on what's called probation. So they're not to commit any crimes when they're on probation, although most of them do. If they violate enough of their probation rules, they can be put back into jail. So, again, in a nutshell, that's kind of what the criminal justice system is based on. Now, we're going to get into the rules of evidence and all those kind of things later on, about how to collect evidence, how to do interviews and interrogations, although we don't call them interrogations anymore, can't do that. We just interview people today. But those lessons are coming. But hopefully for now you have a feel for how the system's set up. So the criminal justice system has these three aspects. It has the criminal side, which law enforcement plays the biggest part in. It has the justice part, which has to do with writing the laws, documenting the laws that the cops are going to enforce, and then it has to do with, of course, the system itself, which is everything tied together to make sure that everything works. And that's where law enforcement, the prosecution, the judicial system, and corrections all play into one. So I hope that gives you a fairly good feel of what you're getting into if you're going to go into law enforcement. And I did this as the first video just to kind of show you what the world is about. It's an uphill battle at all times. So have a good day, be safe, and I hope to see you soon.